He is close.
So, as Kalika said, is this on? Are you here? Are you here? And I won't do this every Sunday, but I'll remind you that but on Tuesday morning, a summary of this class goes out, and simultaneously on the website, Tim Leatherwood publishes the text of this talk that I use. Sometimes I follow it. And the audio that is recorded, which he edits and puts out there, all those things to Richard Wingfield from years ago, who set up the websites and all that sort of stuff. And an audio is published as a podcast on iTunes that you can subscribe to. And then by Wednesday, usually Tim has a video of the class posted. Also on the website, there is, on Tuesday, all the overheads that you will see here are there in PDF format. And I was asking Wayne Herbert a minute ago about the analytics of this class. We can go on the website and see how many people view or download content. And you were saying there were several hundred people on Facebook? Hi. And so if you go on, I'm just saying this to tell you that if you go onto the Ordinary Life website this afternoon, you can look at the video of last Sunday's class. And the beginning of the class was a miracle. There was a miracle. And I'm not going to say anything about that, but I got between 2,000 and 3,000 responses. 2 to 3,000. Asking me how I did that. And I'm not going to answer that question. Now, I thought I would do the next best thing. I thought maybe that I would teach you a magic trick. Okay? And this is not, because I don't do magic tricks, but this is a magic trick. And this is one of the first ones I learned when I started taking up magic. It is called the magic die. And everybody knows what a die is. If you have two of them, you call them dice, a die. And on one side of the die, there is one spot. On the other side of the die, there are 2 spots. On the other side of the die, there are 3 spots. And on the other side of the die, there are 4 spots. It's very, very simple. 1 spot, 2 spots, 3 spots, and 4 spots. Now you want to know how that works. This works on a principle of Gestalt psychology. Now, I say there's 1 spot here. You see that there's 1 spot because you can only see 1 spot. Actually, there are 2 spots. See, when you find out the secret of a trick, it's so disappointing. And if I cover this side of the die, it looks like there are 3 spots because your mind completes the scene. So 3 spots, 2 spots. The reason it looks like 4 spots is because on here there are only 3. Okay, so let's do it again. You go home and make this up. You have 1 spot, you have 2 spots, you have 3 spots, and you have 4 spots. Got it? So you can go home, get your piece of poster board. Now, let me tell you something. If you do this, when you start doing this at home, you have to be very careful about the placement of your hands. All right? Because if you don't place your hands correctly, people will figure out. So what I do is I normally have 3 spots on this side of the card. And on this side of the card, what you can do is that you can also have to make sure that you get your hand placement right. I normally put this spot on that. And sometimes on the other side, what I do is put 5 spots and then on the other side you can go. And I think that people who have trouble with this probably should go get their eyes checked. 6 spots. You go home and make that up. And you can do that. So anyway, I'm grateful to you for being here. I'm grateful to St. Paul's that we can do this. And remember, no matter who you are, no matter where you are on your spiritual journey, you are welcome here. Okay. So I'm going to say something at the beginning that I will repeat near the end. So when you hear these same words again, you'll know to start getting your stuff together to go home. The story that is seeking to gain both our attention and our loyalty is a story of union, wholeness, and healing. Now, I'm sure there are other descriptors that we could put there, but what is seeking to be made known in our time is the story of union and wholeness and healing. The story that we are exposed to almost every waking moment, and the one we are frequently snared by, is the story of separation, comparing, and competing. One is a story of non-duality, and the other is a story of duality. Richard Rohr describes Jesus as the first non-dual teacher in the West, and I think it is ironic that the religion created about Jesus has been one of the most divisive forces on the planet for about 2,000 years. Now, I am convinced that those who created the first stories having to do with the birth of Jesus experienced this oneness, wonder, and awe of this union. Otherwise, they would not have been willing to risk their lives to be involved in a political protest of the Roman Empire that they were. They were attempting, in the language that they had, to communicate this union and wholeness. Now, you know the story, but I want to read you just one version of it. It's a magical story. In those days, a decree went out from Caesar Augustus that all the world should be enrolled. This was the first enrollment when Quirinius was governor of Syria. All went to be enrolled, each to his own city, and Joseph also went up from Galilee, from the city of Nazareth, to Judea, the city of David, which is called Bethlehem, because he was of the lineage of David, to be enrolled with Mary, his betrothed, who was with child. And while they were there, the time came for her to be delivered, and she gave birth to her firstborn son, and wrapped him in swaddling clothes, and laid him in a manger, because there was no place for them in the inn. And in that region there were shepherds out in the field, keeping watch over their flock by night. And an angel of the Lord appeared to them, and the glory of the Lord shone round them, and they were filled with fear. And the angel said, "Be not afraid, for behold, I bring you good tidings of great joy, which shall come to all the people. For to you is born this day in the city of David Christ, who is the Lord. And this will be a sign for you. You will find the babe wrapped in swaddling clothes, lying in a manger." And suddenly there was with the angel a multitude of the heavenly hosts, praising God and saying, "Glory to God in the highest, on earth peace among men with whom he is pleased." When the angels went away from them into heaven, the shepherds said to one another, "Let us go now to Bethlehem and see this thing that has happened, which the Lord has made known to us." And they went in haste and found Mary and Joseph and the babe lying in a manger. And when they saw it, they made known the saying which had been told them concerning the child. And all who heard it wondered at what the shepherds told them. But Mary kept all of these things, pondering them in her heart. This may be the best known story in the whole world. This one and the one in Matthew are the foundation for the most widely observed religious and political holiday. Christmas is the only day in this country that is both a religious holiday and a political holiday. Christmas is celebrated all over the world by the world's diverse Christian population and many people beyond the Western culture. No other religious holiday is as widely commemorated, not even Easter. Lent and Easter are likely the most sacred time of the year, but Christmas is the most widely celebrated. And I believe that how we hear these stories matters. How we interpret these stories matters. And what we think they mean matters. Now you reflect back on your own experience to hearing the story just a moment ago. The story has a tremendous emotional wallop to it. It touches something deep within us, not only because of our childhood memories of the Christmas story, but more. It touches the desire in us for a more hopeful and for a different kind of world. And because of the lack of religious literacy about the Bible and what is in it, most people are only aware of the personal dimensions of the birth stories of Jesus. And we do long for personal transformation. That's why you're here. But most people are not aware of how political these stories are. They challenge the status quo. So during Advent, we sing about tidings of comfort and joy, but these stories are edgy. They're challenging. Now, we frankly don't know a lot about how these stories came to be. As I said last week, the earliest writings in Christian literature and Christian scriptures don't have anything of the birth story. Paul, who was the first writer, seems unaware of any birth tradition. Mark, which is the earliest gospel, does not have a birth story. What we have in Matthew and Luke are two parables that were constructed to introduce the Jesus story. These stories are not factual history. They are mostly theological. That is to say, they reflect the conflict that existed at the time between the growing number of the followers of Jesus and the religion of imperial Rome. These are theological stories. They're theology that's grounded in an understanding of the God that Jesus taught and the understanding of God that Jesus lived. And this makes these stories very relevant for those of us who live in America, because America is in the powerful and perilous position of being the empire of our day. When these stories were created, it was a crime punishable by death to affirm that Jesus was the Son of God and Caesar was not. That Jesus was the Savior of the world and that the emperor was not. That Jesus was Lord, which is one of the first affirmations of faith, and the emperor was not. That Jesus was the way to peace on earth and the emperor was not. So that life with the God of Jesus is both personal and it is political. Now these dimensions can be distinguished, but they cannot be separated. To quote Jesus scholar Marcus Borg, God's dream for us is not simply peace of mind, but peace on earth. So I mentioned last week we don't have one but two stories of the birth of Jesus. They are very, very different. They cannot be harmonized. If you leave out the boring genealogy, it is boring, but it's very important. I'm not going to go into that today. If you leave out the genealogy that's in Matthew, the entire story takes up 31 verses. Very short. Luke's story is about 4 times as long. And of course, though you cannot harmonize these stories, that's exactly what has been done over the past many years. And I am talking in some detail, today's the last Sunday, about these stories because from them has been lifted a single aspect by Christian fundamentalists referred to as the virgin birth. And it's been lifted out and made a fact that one must believe if one is, by Christian fundamentalists, considered to be a Christian. Now, I want to state again, the birth stories are not factually true. And some people hear that and they think, well, okay, if they're not factually true, they must be fairy tales. They must be fables. So I want to speak to both sides of that just briefly. The issue of factuality about these stories, as well as other aspects about the Jesus narratives, is really relatively recent, the product of the last 150 to 180 years. It's new. Early, factuality was not a concern for Christians. Prior to the revelations about the nature of the cosmos, when the culture operated somewhat unconsciously out of what I call a flat earth worldview, taking the Bible literally was just part of conventional wisdom. People didn't focus on the factuality of the Bible or the stories in it. What people focused on was meaning. The Enlightenment generated a dramatically new period in Western culture. And the main thing that it introduced was an entirely different way people focused on 2 questions. How do we know what we know and what is true? How do we know what we know and what is true? What is real? And this led to the sad outcome of some people thinking that truth and factuality are the same. They are not. So that if something is not factually true, it must be fiction or fable. Houston Smith, a scholar of religious history, calls this fact fundamentalism. And what this did with the Enlightenment was create a wave of people calling themselves atheists. Because if it isn't factually true, and most of the Bible isn't, then there's nothing to it. The reaction, formation, response to this among some defenders of the faith has been to resort to claiming things, which people do to this day, that the description of creation in Genesis and the birth stories of Jesus are factually true. So Christian biblical literalism is about biblical factuality. And as I said, comparatively speaking, this is a real recent development. At any rate, it's been in this context that the birth stories were seen either as factually true or as a fable. So the stories get discounted. Now, the fact that divine conceptions were relatively common in the ancient world, or stories about them were, that was common. That's the way ancient people spoke about people who were of great importance. And also the difference between Matthew's account and Luke's account is another reason people just toss them out the window and say, well, there's nothing to them. So the most widely, publicly visible way people have responded to these stories is to take them as facts. Now I want to stress that phrase, the most publicly visible way. It's not the most that people do. Marcus Borg and John Dominic Crossan call this conscious literalism or insistent literalism. And the literalists know these stories are hard to believe, especially the part about the virgin birth. But this is what they say. I know this story doesn't seem likely or possible, but it is the result of the supernatural intervention of God who is all-powerful. You do believe that about God, don't you? If you don't, you must not have much faith. And this is how belief in the virgin birth became a test of faith. If the story isn't factually true, then the Bible and Christianity aren't true either. But I want to offer you another alternative for approaching the birth stories of Jesus. They are not factually true. They are not fictions. They are parables. And I will be forever grateful to the seminary professor who taught in a very straightforward manner that Jesus told parables and that his followers told parables about Jesus, and the birth stories are one of them. Now, you know that the parable of the prodigal son is not a true story. They were not told by Jesus as if they were true stories, but they're more than fables. They carry truths that are profoundly significant. So that a parable is not about factuality, it's about meaning. And meaning does not depend on something that is factually true. When Jesus told his parables, the parable of the prodigal son, the parable of the Good Samaritan, nobody interrupted him and said, "Hey, is that a real story?" And somebody who was in the crowd listening to Jesus offer his parables didn't punch the guy next to him and say, "Just making this stuff up, you know." So the meaning and truth conveyed in the birth stories about Jesus don't depend on factuality. Indeed, to focus on factuality misses the meaning. What matters historically about these stories is the historical context in which they were created. Just like our culture immerses us in a story that we take for granted, much as a fish takes water for granted, the same is true for the culture in which these stories were created. People in the time that Jesus had his ministry took for granted that Caesar was the Prince of Peace, that Caesar was the Savior of the world. These are titles that were given to Caesar at the time. And just as Jesus told parables to get his hearers to see things differently, so did his disciples. And these stories are subversive. Who was the king of the Jews? At the time of Jesus, that title belonged to Herod. So the disciples took it and gave it to Jesus. Who was the Son of God? Who was Lord? Who was Savior of the world? Who brings peace on earth? At the time, all of those titles were given to Caesar. So these stories bestow those titles onto Jesus. Who's the light of the world? Not the emperor, but Jesus. Now, it's not my purpose today to elaborate on these stories in full. I simply want to demonstrate to you that they were not told as factual truths. They were never to be taken that way. But Christian fundamentalism has not only gone for the literal truth of these stories, but has also lifted out a single phrase and made it into an ecclesiastical law that says, believe this or else. Now, if you're interested in more detail about these stories, I highly recommend to you a little book by Marcus Borg and John Dominic Crossan called The First Christmas. It is very easy to read. It's a quick read, and it's a good companion to their book called The Last Week. Those two books are like bookends of the whole Jesus narrative. I'm going to end the talk today talking more as I begin about non-duality, but I just want to stress again that truth is not about factuality. There is knowledge and information. These have largely to do with the realm of duality, and they're important. You couldn't have gotten here in your car today if you didn't know knowledge and information. You need to be dualistic in many things in this world. But then there is the realm of wisdom and understanding, and these have largely to deal with the realm of non-reality. Spiritual truth has to do with values that serve the good of the human community and not with the things that divide us. Truth has much more to do with what is wise and useful than who is right or wrong. Now, the birth stories about Jesus, from which the teaching about the virgin birth is taken, were not created to present us with some picture of baby Jesus meek and mild. Rather, they were, as I said, cutting political confrontations with the powers that held sway at the time. These stories were considered treasonable at the time they were taught because they sought to overthrow the established order. Now, I don't care where you are on the political spectrum, where you place yourself. We are all part of the established order of our time and this world, which makes hearing almost any part of the Jesus narrative so difficult for us. The virgin birth has never been about biology. It's a spiritual teaching. And what is at stake in the story is not the biology of the mother, but the spiritual nature of the child. In their pre-Copernican flat earth worldview, it was about God invading the world. So what Matthew and Luke are saying is, we want to introduce you to someone who wants to introduce you to God. And the person that we want to introduce you to isn't Caesar. And I would add to that, it isn't your country, it isn't your political party, it isn't your military, your economic system, or any of the institutions we put or labels we put on ourselves to define ourselves. Our true identity is only who we are in God, and as long as we allow anything else to define us, we won't know this. You know, I'm interested in offering talks in this current theme of living in the gap between the no longer and the not yet by deconstructing the terrible teachings of Christian fundamentalism. I think all fundamentalism is destructive and eventually leads to some kind of violence. One of the violent things done by the teachings of Christian fundamentalism, including that of the virgin birth, is that it keeps what are called true believers in an infantilized state. It keeps people from growing up into mature adults who begin to take personal responsibility for the world that we are creating. The focus of the misunderstood birth stories is not to focus on a vulnerable baby lying in a manger. Human vulnerability is something we need to pay attention to, but it is done from the standpoint of the empowerment by adult, spiritual human beings who are exercising wisdom and understanding. So the birth stories are parables. And though they have value to offer us, they were created out of a patriarchal agenda. It's one of the things that cripples the world today is patriarchy. And they were designed to keep people as childlike as possible. Subdued, obedient, loyal, uncritical, passive, fearful. A believe this or else mentality does not encourage adult faith. Now, if you live yourself into these infancy parables, the main focus is on, beyond just the political nature of the story, the Great Spirit, who brings life and hope to everything, who brings light to everyone. Mary, who collaborates with this Great Spirit, represents humanity in its endless role to be willing to bring new life to situations. And from an evolutionary point of view, this is God's primary activity. Radiant in every aspect of creation. So in these birth stories, we see the primordial creative force, and it's not some patriarchal male, but it's a mother-like creature of prodigious activity. In and through Mary, the womb of God, and the womb of the universe are one. And birthing is the enduring legacy which every human creature is given responsibility for. You know, this doesn't get talked about much, but from the very beginning of the Jesus narrative, Stephen Mitchell in his Gospel of Jesus elaborates on this extensively. There was a rumor that Jesus was an illegitimate child. Now, true or not, but likely true. That brings us to another profound paradox, because it makes the nativity an embarrassment, one of risk, one of danger, one of predictability. Gods don't get crucified. It symbolizes, among other things, all of those who sacrifice their lives for the sake of empowering justice. This is what the birth stories are about. They're not about biology. The human face of God is not that of the classic dominant patriarchal male. Now, this is a parable, remember? The human face of God, the story of God's birth, if you will, is a relational event. And it is a mixture of all of creation. Shepherds and astrologers, a manger, mountain pastures, a picture of an interdependent universe to which humans belong. Humans have known this for a few million years before the arrival of Jesus. The world is not exclusively Christian. I want to read you a passage from Darren Muchu's book, Incarnation, A New Revolutionary Threshold. And this will be in the text that goes down. It will tax your brain a little bit. He's not the clearest writer in the world, but I think what he says here is so wonderful. Christmas is the great Christian feast. In fact, the greatest of them all. Salvation and redemption belong first and foremost to the primordial birthing forth, not to the almighty act of dying. Resurrection has more in common with Bethlehem than with Calvary. It, the crucifixion story, is indeed the renewed birth, this time facilitated through another archetypical female, another Mary, Mary Magdalene. Here, the incarnational logic of the Christian faith comes full circle. From the cave of the original birth, which is a womb, there is another archetypical cave, the empty tomb, that releases a new wave of incarnational empowerment, and the risen one becomes the symbolic catalyst carrying creation forward to its evolutionary breakthrough. So, I'm going to go back and repeat what I said. The story that is seeking to gain our attention and our loyalty is one of union, wholeness, and healing. And you find other descriptors. The story that we are exposed to almost every waking moment, and the one we are frequently snared by, is the story of separation, division, comparing, and competing. One is the story of non-duality, and the other is the story of duality. Now, you likely couldn't live in Houston or hear me speak without being aware that the cardiologist to whom I give credit for saving my life, and with whom over a period of almost 10 years we had developed a different kind of doctor-patient relationship, he was killed 2 weeks ago, murdered in a targeted attack. And the person who committed this vile deed ended up taking his own life. I was at lunch this week with a dear friend of mine, a person whom I love very much and who's very smart and very wise, a person who's spoken here before. And she asked me a question. She said, if the man who killed Mark Houseconneck had not taken his own life, but had gone to trial, what punishment would you give? I said, I I would have him be a surgical attendant in the cardiovascular surgery room at Texas Children's Hospital for eternity. She said, I'd have him be a receiving attendant at Benton Emergency Room. The most direct way to disrupt the story of separation is to give a person an experience of non-separation. We're trying to create a more beautiful world, not sustain the one we have. Not one where violence is seen as a solution to violence. Richard Rohr has described Jesus as being the first non-dual teacher of the West. And as I said, it's ironic that the religion created in his name has been one of the most divisive forces on this planet for 2,000 years. There are teachers within the Christian tradition, as there are spiritual masters in every living tradition, that embody an attempt to communicate non-dual reality or non-dual mind. And one of these is Jim Finley. Thomas Merton was Jim Finley's spiritual director when Finley entered the monastery. And later, after leaving the monastery and becoming a Buddhist and a psychologist, and by the way, there's no contradiction or conflict in being both a follower of Jesus and a Buddhist, Finley wrote a spiritual biography of Thomas Merton called Merton's Palace in Bower. Now there's a good non-dual title for you. Finley said that he struggled with how to write the last chapter of that book. It would be about non-dual mind. And what he finally realized was that you can't communicate non-dual mind. It communicates itself. But that doesn't keep spiritual teachers from still trying to do it, trying to communicate it. So several years ago, Richard Rohr's Center for Action and Contemplation began a new publication called Wholeness, O-N-E-I-N-G. And wanting is a word that was coined by Julian of Norwich to express and communicate what she described as the union that spiritual work seeks both to describe and create a context for. And in the first issue of Wanting, which is sadly now out of print, this small book concludes with an essay by Finley that I want to read to you. Imagine you're out walking on the beach, and God says, go ahead, pick up a grain of sand. Any grain. No matter what grain of sand you choose, God is present in it. Since God is not subject to division or diminishment of any kind, God is completely present in that one tiny grain of sand. Furthermore, since the whole universe flows from God, is sustained by God, and subsists in God, you are holding in your hand a grain of sand in which you, along with the whole universe and everyone and everything in it, is wholly present. Finley says in his teaching that God sustains us in such a way that if God stopped being God, we would cease to be. Go back to Finley. Surprised by such an all-encompassing oneness, you begin to get a little weak in the knees. And then God moves in to finish you off by suddenly expanding this awareness of realized oneness in all directions. Go ahead, God says. Pick a place, a situation, a circumstance in which you might find yourself. If you choose a wooded area, you see yourself in your mind's eye surrounded by trees. God is there, inviting you to reach out and pick a leaf off one of the low-hanging branches. As you do so, you realize you are holding a leaf in which the totality of reality is wholly present. No matter what you might choose, you realize that you are choosing something in which God is wholly present, loving you and all people and all things into being. Then God invites you to reflect on any aspect of yourself. No matter what aspect of yourself you focus on, God is there, wholly present in each breath, each thought, each feeling, each turn of your head. You realize as you sit that God is present as the ungraspable immediacy of your sitting. As you laugh, God is there in your laughter. As you cry, God is wholly present in each tear that falls from your eyes. It does not matter what little thing you might choose within or around you. It might just be the thing that awakens you from your fitful dream of being separate from God, who is the reality of yourself and all that is real. May each of us be so fortunate as to be overtaken by God in the midst of little things. May we, in having our illusory separate self slain by God, be born into a new and true awareness of who we really are with God, one with God forever. And may we continue on in this true awareness, seeing in each and every little thing we see the fullness of God's presence in our lives. May we also be someone in whose presence others are better able to recognize God's presence in their lives, so that they too might know the freedom of the children of God. It's such a beautiful passage. So I want to join with those unnamed early followers of Jesus who created these parables to say, I want to introduce you to someone who wants to introduce you to a mystery that can lead you into a life of union, wholeness, and healing. This is the better story that is seeking to gain both our attention and our loyalty. It is the more beautiful world that our hearts know is possible. No matter where you go this week, no matter what happens, remember this, you carry a precious cargo, so watch your step, and I will see you here next week.